This episode is brought to you by HP Plus. In a world full of smart devices, isn't it about time your printer got smart too? Now printing is smart with HP Plus, and the HP Smart app is how it all happens. You can print from your phone with just a tap, no matter where you are, even from your garage/home office/yoga studio. Huh, that is smart. HP Plus. Learn more about smart printing at hp.com/smart.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to New Books in Performing Arts, a podcast from the New Books Network. My name is Andy Boyd, and I'm talking today with Nate Chinen, author of the book Playing Changes, Jazz for the New Century. Nate, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you tell us a bit about your history with jazz and how you became a jazz critic?
Sure. I guess those are two separate but related questions. In terms of my history with the music, I came up in a musical family in Honolulu. Both of my parents were singers and entertainers, and they both, although they weren't jazz artists, they both came up at a time when jazz was really, a major part of popular culture. And so I was surrounded by musicians and the sort of life of the entertainment industry. And so jazz kind of naturally hit my radar as a result of that. But becoming a critic is another story. My parents were certainly more on the performer end of the spectrum. And I, for quite some time, thought I might become a jazz drummer and was quite serious about it. But I went to college in Philadelphia and fell into the Philadelphia jazz scene as a player. But at the same time, I was an English major who, had always loved to write. And long story short, through an internship that I fortuitously got at the Philadelphia City paper, I kind of put two and two together and realized, I love to write. I have a certain, amount of critical faculty, and I know the history of the music. Why don't I put all of this together and begin to write about the music, both, in a sort of reporting way and as a critical observer. So that's kind of how it all came together I guess now it was in 1996. So, I'm terrible at math. What is that, like 25
years ago?
25 years ago.
Yeah. Did you conceive of this book, Playing Changes, as kind of filling a gap in the existing literature? I
did. I definitely had that feeling from the beginning, really, from the very beginning of the genesis of this project. It partly arose out of a feeling that there was a gap in the literature. There are so many great books about jazz, and most of them take the measure of the 20th century and articulate a kind of lifespan for the music. And so if you suggest that jazz is born around the beginning of the 20th century and reaches, maturity around mid-century, well, then you're effectively buying into the idea that it begins to wane and peter out towards the end of the 20th century. And in my experience as a critic, as a listener, and as a fan of this music, that really wasn't the case at all. In fact, I felt like there was so much that had happened around the turn of the century and in the first decade or so of the 21st that there was just all this evidence pointing toward the idea that not only is this not a moribund life form or something that is, on the wane, but actually jazz is in extraordinarily good health. And there are all these reasons to believe that it's in the midst of a kind of creative, I don't know if you'd say renaissance, but just a really, really productive and creative period.
Yeah, I'm 29 and I started listening to jazz, somewhat seriously in college, so about 10 years ago. And I always sort of wondered, is my perception that now is a really good time for jazz just because this is the time I started listening to jazz, or
right.
Is there some real, substance to that?
I mean, that's a perfectly valid, I think recency bias and sort of personal experience bias is, totally understandable. What's funny though is I grew up at a time when the culture around the music was so oriented towards uh, preservation and conservation that for a good part of my early experience, I felt like I had missed out on all of
Mhm.
the really good stuff. It's a really pervasive feeling that, especially at that time, it was hard to shake, because so much of the discourse and marketing around the music was geared towards celebrating the glories that had come and gone. Um, and so to be, I was turning on to the music in the 1980s and 90s, and at that time, yeah, there was stuff to be excited about, but in terms of what I had access to, um, I just felt like, oh, if only I had been around in the 40s or in the 50s or in the 60s. And so it's been nice actually to see a generational shift along those lines. When I meet listeners your age or even younger, they they often tend to feel excited about what has happened on their watch.
Mhm.
And that's a cool shift. Like that to me speaks of a kind of success in terms of the way this music is being presented out in the world.
Yeah. One of the ways that jazz history is often told is as these sort of struggles between rival factions with different ideas about what the shape of jazz should be. And there was a big one kind of in the 70s and 80s where there were, traditionalists or preservationists or whatever term you want to use, people like Wynton Marsalis, and then more experimental musicians like the people clustered around the AACM. Do you think enough time has passed from that controversy to say basically who won?
I will I will demur on the notion that there was a winner.
Sure.
I really don't think there was. I think that we are the victors in the sense that um, those scrabbling tensions now seem so like weirdly quaint and outmoded. Um, I
And
look
they were
at
very personal at the time. Like
oh
some of the people
sure
on each
yeah
side were really vicious.
there was deep investment in this idea. The schism that was certainly amplified by the media at the time, but if you were on the scene, you had a sense that this was real, that this was actually happening at ground level. And so one of the things that I am most pleased about when I look at the culture of this music is that we've not only reached a kind of detente in the so-called jazz wars, but we've completely moved past that whole um, diametric framework. I look at the success of a musician like trumpeter Ambrose Akinmusire, who has just not really had a false step in his career. Each one of his albums is essential, and this is a musician who won the prestigious Thelonious Monk International Jazz Competition. Really the sort of ultimate proving ground for proficiency within the tradition. He's someone who can hang with anybody, and he's also he's drawing from hip hop and other forms of music. He's incorporating string quartets. He is paying homage to heroes like Roscoe Mitchell from the Art Ensemble of Chicago and the AACM. Um, that's the kind of musician who really shows, how stupid the idea of all of these camps is. And I think he's indicative of this generation of players who they were able to sort of look at those squabbles and say, like, what's the point of that? Like, why would I not pull the stuff that most interests me from everywhere, from both sides of this fence and from that fence and everywhere else. And so that to me is a really, really happy outcome. And it's something that is quite different in this day and age than it was, let's say in the 90s or even,
Mhm.
in the very early 2000s.
Yeah, that also reminds me of Cecil McLaurin Salvant. I feel like she's another singer who is in some ways very traditional, and then in some ways, I mean, she doesn't really sound like anybody else except for sounding a little bit like Abby Lincoln, you know?
Yeah, Cecile is. I mean, she is a genius. Let's just say that right up front. I'm very proud of the fact that she is the very first musician named in the book, in the foreword, because although her career was in quite a different place when I was writing this book several years ago, it was already clear that she was just hugely important. And when you say that she is kind of a traditionalist, I think of Cecile as a traditionalist, but absolutely not a conservative. You know, and that's an important distinction. I think that she is engaged in this really vital process of interrogating the tradition, and forming a kind of critical dialogue with the lineage and the history of the music and the musicians and the culture. Um, and that's just so exciting. It's because it's not settled. That's one thing that she really shows us. That the history is. It's not only that the art form is alive, but the history is alive. I think that's a really fascinating and provocative process. And then all of that, I say all of that, and we haven't even mentioned that she's also just an incredible voice and presence and musician. So like there's all this stuff happening intellectually, but just on a very basic level, she's also just an incredible singer and an incredible artist.
Yeah. I love how she sings these sort of songs that are kind of purposely squeamish from the tradition. She'll choose something that seems maybe a little antiquated or a little sexist or something to kind of point up that aspect of these standards.
Oh, sure. Yeah. She is not interested in passive engagement with the music. She doesn't want you to sit back and get comfortable. she's interested in discomfort. She's interested in the productivity of of that squeamishness, right? There's some gold in those hills, and that's that. I really love her for that. It's never boring.
Yeah. I'd love to talk more about this sense that you mentioned of kind of contemporary jazz rewriting jazz history in a way. Who are some of the jazz artists of the past who are kind of being rediscovered and reevaluated through the lens of contemporary jazz?
Well, one really notable example, I would say, is Alice Coltrane, who has always been a figure revered by a certain subset of people, including many outside of what we would think of as a jazz audience. Alice Coltrane's music of the 1960s and 70s, especially, it has always meant something. But within the jazz establishment or within the jazz discourse, she's always been something of an outlier, and certainly subordinate to the titanic achievements of her husband, John Coltrane. Now, I'm talking about the discourse. It's been really, really cool and interesting to see that narrative shift a bit over the last, I'd say, decade, and really come to a more holistic understanding of the Coltranes as a couple in dialogue with each other and supporting one another, and really after a lot of the same goals musically and spiritually. And you are almost as likely now to, when you talk to younger musicians, you're almost as likely to encounter reverence for Alice Coltrane as you are reverence for John Coltrane. And I don't think that is some kind of corrective, but it is like a really important adjustment. And I think it is giving her the recognition that she is due. And it's also here's where I'm really fascinated. It also actually shifts our understanding of John Coltrane and his work to place it in active dialogue with the work of Alice. It's a really important thing to think about. And so much of what we are seeing in jazz studies and in contemporary jazz criticism involves a kind of realignment of the context. Putting things into the right perspective in terms of the social cultural element, in terms of the historical element. Um, Jazz criticism was in mid-century was really heavily influenced by the sort of edicts of the new criticism, which, for all the literary theory buffs out there, we're talking about the primacy of the text and the sort of, the idea that authorial intention is really like not what we're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we're finally seeing sort of the end of that arc. It's not that we can't close read a text. It's not that we can't listen to a piece of music and evaluate it strictly on its formal properties. But I think we are understanding just how rich the conversation can be when we factor in all of the forces that go into, the creation of this art.
Because part of what that old kind of new critical influence framework doesn't really allow for us to look at, for example, the political implications of a lot of this music. I mean, a lot of the best jazz of the 70s was written very explicitly in the context of the Black Arts movement.
Right. And this is an issue we are, as a jazz community, we have been reckoning with. It was in the early 60s that Amiri Baraka wrote his landmark essay, Jazz and the White Critic, which really just comes right out and says it. Most important jazz artists have been Black, and most jazz critics have been white. And there is an issue there. I think that to be actively observing the scene today and to write with any kind of insight about someone like Kamasi Washington or Thundercat or Robert Glasper or Esperanza Spalding, you really need to think about that cultural context. And I'm not saying that you have to be a product of an African-American community, but you certainly need to be in dialogue with one. You certainly need to understand that there's a social nexus here, and a set of signifiers, and this stuff is not happening in a vacuum. And I think I don't want to throw like the entire history of jazz criticism under the bus here, but I'm just noting that this is a set of priorities that I did not feel I inherited when I began doing this work. It's something that I feel like I've had to construct a little bit, over the course of doing this job. And it's a learning process. It's really exciting because I feel like that process is never unfinished.
You mentioned Kamasi Washington, and I think he's one of the most interesting figures in contemporary jazz because, I mean, he kind of came into public notice with this album, The Epic, which is a triple album, almost all of instrumental music. I mean, there's some songs with vocals, but it's not an album you would expect to be a big crossover hit, and yet it was. What do you think accounts for that?
Well, I think first and foremost, there was just the undeniable magnetism of his presence, and I don't know that it had to happen at that moment. I feel like if the Epic had been released, a few years earlier or a few years later, we would have seen a similar thing. But Kamasi, just if you have the experience of seeing him, especially, it's undeniable, and this is why I chose to begin chapter 1 of the book with basically a description of the impression that he made on stage during that year when he seemed to be everywhere. Like I have rarely seen an arrival unfold like that. And it was really, truly a remarkable thing. Um, and so I wanted to chronicle that. And what really interested me, and this was the most this was the trickiest puzzle for me to put together in the book. Really, was connecting that rise, that emergence, to the idea of jazz, uh, the jazz messiah, right, or the jazz savior, which is this enduring trope over the years. And so, what does it mean? Why is there even this need for such a figure? And what is it that Kamasi was supposed to do to fulfill that role? So these were all a part of the equation as I tried to sort of lay the groundwork for that opening chapter.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the founder and editor of the New Books Network. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably love to read. I know I do. So I'd like to recommend you subscribe to Scribd. Scribd is the ultimate reading subscription service, letting you explore all of your interests in any format you choose: ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, and more for only $9.99 a month. All your favorite things are there. You get an entire library for less than the cost of a single book. No complicated credit cards or additional purchases required. If you're not sure what to read, Scribd combines the latest technology with the best human minds to recommend content that you'll love. Want to change things up? You're free to switch between titles, genres, and formats at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And here's the best news. Right now, Scribd is offering NBN listeners a free 60-day trial. Go to try.scribd.com/NBN for your free trial. That's try.scribd.com/NBN to get 60 days of Scribd for free.
I think part of what Kamasi Washington's appeal maybe has to do with is his association with Kendrick Lamar. He was one of the many jazz artists who've worked with Kendrick Lamar on various albums. And I guess that opens up the question of, what do you see being the relationship between contemporary jazz and contemporary hip hop?
Well, there's a very close relationship, and you have to note from the outset that that the relationship goes to the root of both musics. It's not a matter of crossing over. It's a matter of, a tangled root system that feeds both musical forms. To put it plainly, this is Black music. And so when we talk about jazz and hip hop, there are lots of artificial this meets that kinds of experiments. But the most exciting, I think, always come back to that idea that the one was built out of the other, and if you look at the kinds of breaks that form the backbone of early hip hop, there's a lot of James Brown, but there's a lot of jazz in there. Really the building blocks of the sound of hip hop were jazz informed from the very beginning. And the process, that sonic process, not in the most obvious ways, but there's an ingenuity and a kind of alert resourcefulness to the unexpected. All of that feels very attuned to a jazz impulse to me. So, that's how I would begin to answer that question. It's obviously taken many different shapes and forms along the way.
Yeah, I was surprised how much space you devoted to Jay Dilla, who's not usually thought of as being a jazz musician, but obviously his influence is very, very broad in contemporary hip hop and contemporary jazz.
Yeah, when I set out to map this book, one of the first questions I asked myself was, okay, well, who are the most influential figures to emerge since the turn of the century? And Jay Dilla was one of the people I very quickly named. And what I really wanted to do in bringing him into this was not just talk about the vogue of people kind of invoking him, but really place him into that continuum, as a as an avatar of like the evolution of jazz rhythm, and texture and ensemble dynamics, and thankfully and helpfully, I had a great sort of conduit to that whole line of argument in Robert Glasper, who worked directly with Dilla and who speaks, with very keen insight on the ways in which Dilla really functioned as a jazz musician. But I was already seeing evidence everywhere that the innovations that Dilla introduced, especially with respect to groove and just the way that beat feels, the way that the rhythm just kind of feels good but a little disjointed. I was already seeing so much evidence of that becoming an essential part of the toolkit for jazz musicians. It's like people talk about Tony Williams's ride cymbal and Elvin Jones's polyrhythms. There's all these things that are signatures. Well, if you are a first tier jazz drummer today, all of that, and you also know the realm of Jay Dilla. It's a part of the language. So that was a big part of what I wanted to address.
One other intersection between jazz and hip hop that you talk about in the book that I found really interesting is how a lot of contemporary jazz albums are basically made as a remix from the start, where people will record, 60 hours of live shows and then cut it up into an hour-long album. I mean, that's very similar to the ways that a hip hop artist would sample, a huge crate of records to make one song.
And that's a very recent development, and I was happy that I was able to get that into the book, because it was really like happening as I was writing. It's become kind of its own subgenre in a way, but we have people like Jeff Parker, the guitarist, and Micaiah McCraven, the drummer. We have them to thank for that. They're not the only ones, but they're two of the most vivid examples of that. I think when I was writing about Jeff Parker's album, The New Breed, I wrote about that process, and I used the phrase, I think I said it was like a farm to table instrumental hip hop album. And by that I meant he was growing the grooves that provided the samples for the sort of imagined hip hop tracks that he was then reconstructing with a live band. So yeah, there's all these layers on it. And it's very cool. It's another example of just the creativity that happens both through the use of technology, and just the complete metabolism of a language.
Didn't Miles Davis do something a bit similar in the late 60s and early 70s, where he would kind of record a bunch of material and then cut it up for an album?
Well, Miles was not a producer, but he had a genius producer in Teo Macero, who did. I mean, you have to imagine that back then, this was tape splicing with 1/4-inch and razor blades. But yeah, everything from In a Silent Way to Bitches Brew, these were albums that were quite literally constructed out of, hours and hours of kind of hazy, formless jams. And then subsequently, with the example of Bitches Brew, at least, Miles then took that on the road. And so you're right in identifying a similar process, because when Miles goes to the Fillmore East and the Fillmore West in 1970, 1971, he's got a live band that is playing the music from Bitches Brew. But when those musicians were creating Bitches Brew, they had a much less clear sense of what was happening. They couldn't see it because they were in it. But once the album was created and there was this kind of finished product, then they could say, oh, well, this is how this song goes, Right. So yeah, that translation process has been a part of the picture for quite a while.
Another genre that contemporary jazz brushes up against is indie rock, and you devote a chapter to Brad Mehldau, and you compare him to David Foster Wallace, which I thought was an interesting
Right.
comparison. Could you explain kind of that comparison?
Sure. It was really a quote that got me there, and I don't want to misquote David Foster Wallace, so I won't restate it here. But there's a quote in that chapter where he talks about, and it's from a pretty famous essay of his about television, and what he's talking about is the idea that like the old revolutionaries were sort of the sardonic nihilists, and maybe the new revolution is actually a sort of embrace of sincerity and feeling and openness. It's a very kind of 90s like pushing against the grain sort of argument. It's sort of like an argument against irony. And I found that really useful because Brad Mehldau, who self-identifies as a member of the Gen X cohort, a lot of what he was doing really was a similar thing. He had internalized all of these ideas that were really congruent with what was happening in grunge music and in the the writing of people like Foster Wallace. But he was also, a jazz pianist and composer who was really unabashedly attracted to lyricism and beauty and Brahms and so he was wrestling with this idea of, well, I want to make it new, but I want to honor the old, but has everything already been done before? But I don't want to be, I don't want to create a pastiche, So there were a lot of struggles that had to do with his relationship to the past. And this is why the Brad Mehldau profile chapter arrives so early in the narrative of this book, because I see him as a transitional figure from this kind of late 20th century valorization of the past and an early 21st century focus on the future. I think he straddles those two preoccupations in a really fascinating way. And he's not the only person. He belongs to this peer group. But he, for me, was he was a useful character, with which to explore those ideas.
I hate to ask a third question in a similar format, but yet a third genre that contemporary jazz deals with is contemporary classical music. Mm-hmm. And there you write quite a bit about John Zorn, who, also takes from klezmer and metal and punk and, so many other different influences. What do you see being the kind of larger relationship between jazz and what we might call new music?
Well, it's changed quite a bit, even just in the last 20 years, and I think you're right that a big subtext of what we're discussing in this book is the idea that jazz is not cordoned off in some I don't know.
A small set of dark rooms downtown.
Exactly. It's really in dialogue with so much, right? It's in dialogue with all these other forms, and not just musical forms. But to answer your question specifically, we've seen some really, really exciting developments along this overlap between jazz and I guess what you'd call new music. And some of it we touch on in probably most directly in the chapter that is anchored by pianist and composer Vijay Iyer. Mm-hmm. And for that, I went to the Ojai Music Festival, which is a contemporary classical music festival in California, and it has a different artistic director every year. And the year that I went, it was Vijay who had the reins, and it was the first time that an improviser was in that position. And it was really interesting because, Vijay is in dialogue with the classical world, like in a real way. One of the pieces he presented there was a violin concerto for Jennifer Coe. He had also written pieces for the Brentano String Quartet. But one of Vijay's close collaborators is a drummer and composer named Taishan Sori. And to see Taishan navigating that space at Ojai was really like seeing something click into place, because he's a perfect example of the kind of musician who I cannot imagine existing or thriving, I guess I should say, at a different point in history. Taishan is a genius improviser who is the most serious kind of classical composer, and just able to he's just able to operate in both spaces with absolute integrity and total authority. And he's doing something new that feels challenging and sort of endlessly fascinating. And he's doing it in a way that does not surrender to the sort of preconceptions of any musical style, but he's just one sort of rare exceptional example. I think that if you look at what's happening both in jazz and in classical music, it wasn't that long ago that that improvising protocols, both for individual soloists and for ensembles, they were fairly exotic in the classical music realm, and they're really not anymore. I feel like to be an ambitious young classically trained musician, you should have familiarity with improvisation. And, that doesn't necessarily have to mean idiomatic jazz improvisation, but you should be familiar with the idea of improvising on your instrument, sometimes according to, prescriptions or guidelines, and sometimes in a very open sort of way. And that's a fairly new development, and it's a direct result of the engagement of musicians like Vijay and Taishan, and various others.
I've seen Taishan Sori with a couple of I've seen him with John Zorn, I've seen him with Vijay Iyer, I've seen him with Ambrose Akin Musuri, and every time I see him, he's the only thing I can look at on stage. I'm right. I believe I have the ticket stub. I know I saw Vijay Iyer, but I did not look at Vijay Iyer during that 90-minute concert.
Well,
no shade to Vijay Iyer at all.
No, I don't think Vijay would disagree with you. I mean, Taishan is just one of those figures, and this is a good example actually of, the kind of snapshot in time element of a book. Taishan appears, quite a bit in that Vijay Iyer chapter. If I were writing this book, 5 years from now, I have very little doubt that Taishan would merit a chapter of his own. Mm-hmm. But at the time that I was writing this book, I thought about it and I said, you know what, like if I write a chapter about Taishan now at this phase in his career, it will feel so out of date so quickly, and so I'd rather actually give him a little bit more breathing room, and possibly revisit him. And there are a handful of other musicians I felt that way about, which again points to just the sheer superabundance of this moment. There are so many interesting things happening along so many different frequencies. That's just the best news possible.
Mm-hmm. Another one of the kind of big stories that run throughout your book is the story of how jazz has become institutionalized over the past 40 years, mm-hmm. both in the Academy and at places like Jazz at Lincoln Center, which would have been unthinkable in the 60s. What are some ways that this process has affected the evolution of the genre?
That's a complicated question because it touches so many different facets of the ecology of the art form. On the one hand, it's really important that jazz has the support of an institution like Lincoln Center. The fact that it has a permanent home, that Jazz at Lincoln Center is its own institution with its own resources. It's really an important thing, and I think there are people who take issue with Jazz Lincoln Center for one reason or another, but the fact that this thing exists and that it's doing the work that it does is really remarkable. And other organizations like SF Jazz and Jazz St. Louis and the Earshot Jazz in Seattle, they're all doing the work, and some of it is about preserving performance opportunities, and some of it is about jazz education or jazz appreciation. So that's all really, really important, especially for a music that has often, and the coronavirus pandemic really exposed this. Not that it was a surprise, but jazz has often just been this hand-to-mouth kind of economic system. There's really not a whole lot of a support network, and so that points to the need for institutions that are able to weather a harsh climate like this one. Now, you mentioned institutions. I can't disentangle that from the rise and the sort of dominance of institutionalized jazz education, which I devote a full chapter in the book to that. And to me, this is maybe a provocative thing to say, but I feel like no single force has been more influential in ways both good and bad on the state of the art over the last 40 years or so. I think the rise of jazz education, it's just been transformative. And again, I said there are pros and cons there. But I think that the influence is undeniable.
It sort of reminds me of that Duke Ellington interview clip where he says, "My conservatory was the Savoy Ballroom."
Right.
And, if someone like Duke Ellington were born today, his conservatory would be a conservatory, which obviously has its pluses and minuses.
Well, so much of that has to do with just the way that culture has changed. I've been thinking about this a bit during the pandemic as we look at this, completely broken infrastructure. And just thinking, well, how are we going to rebuild this thing, and what can we do to ensure that it's actually better? That it's actually more equitable and more humane, and all of these things. And one thought I had was, we did not design it this way, but for most high-level jazz musicians, pre-pandemic, a really big portion of their energy and time was spent traveling, to Europe or to Japan or China or wherever, to earn a living on the road. And there's really not that kind of robust network in North America as there used to be. If you look at the date book for the Duke Ellington Orchestra, it's really fascinating. I once took a look at a stretch in the mid 50s, when they were playing the Newport Jazz Festival every year, and they would play, they'd play a concert in a ballroom in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And then the next day they would play at a department store opening, in Sioux City. And then the next day they would be, at an outdoor festival. And the next day they would be in the recording studio somewhere. And it's really just like, it's kind of amazing because you realize like, this is a band that was just working almost every day. They were just constantly on the road. And there was I don't think it was easy for them, but there was a sustainable network at that time, and anyone who's tried to put together a cross-country tour for a contemporary jazz artist knows, it's pretty rough. There are these hot spots, but there's a lot of dead zone in this country. And I think, what would it mean to really invest in something that felt more like a real network, Mm-hmm. I think that would really be transformative, but we're dreaming big here, right?
Sure. Yeah, you get that same sense reading Ralph Ellison's essays. He's growing up in Oklahoma, and yet he sees everybody at that time. And he does, he sees the local guys, but he also sees all of the important jazz musicians of the time coming to tour in Oklahoma.
Right. I mean,
yeah.
People passing through town, that's a thing that used to happen a lot more often.
Yeah. You do focus most of your book on the US, but you also have a chapter where you look at a lot of international jazz, including the scenes in London, in China, and across Latin America. How do you see jazz adapting in these different contexts?
Well, if you talk about jazz as a kind of language or a set of proficiencies or a process, then it really can thrive anywhere. It doesn't have anything to do with its place of origin, and I think that we've seen that there are regional variations and different inflections, based on where the music takes root. I have received, I think, probably the most frequent critique that I've seen relating to this book, and it's one that I always will accept with humility, is that there's not a lot of focus on, for instance, the European scene. There's a lot of people who've read this book who are based in that scene who say, well, this is really a U.S. focused narrative, and that's true. And the reason for that is because I really felt like I had witnessed enough firsthand that this book for me was really a kind of, first and foremost, it was bearing witness. It was trying to bring some sense and some clarity to what I had, really seen unfolding, primarily in New York City, over the last 20, 25 years. And I sincerely hope that we will see, a kind of European answer to Playing Changes. I think eventually we'll begin to see a similar book that focuses just on the Chinese jazz scene. In fact, there's a little bit of energy around precisely that story right now. Mm-hmm. But I'm getting away from the heart of your question, which I think has to do with the sort of polyglot nature of the art form. And I think this is increasingly this is an international proposition. Jazz has always been informed by musics that come from beyond American shores. Obviously, the music that comes from the African continent to the U.S. by way of the Caribbean, places like Cuba. That's square one. That's where it begins. So it's always been informed by all of these other sources. And I think what's really cool is to see successive generations of musicians who take the time to master the art form sort of like on its own merits, and also really seriously deal with the cultural underpinnings that they call their own. And so I think a great example of this is alto saxophonist Miguel Zenon, who's from Puerto Rico, which of course is still American, but it is culturally a different set of signifiers. And Miguel, for him, as I write in the book, there was a kind of translation process where he was so determined to be a serious jazz musician that he kind of put his own heritage on hold while he was, striving to master that language. But subsequently, he realized then that he was not in full dialogue, with all of his influences, and he began to reincorporate them. And that's when the really interesting stuff happened, and so we're now seeing a really interesting flourishing of a kind of Afro-Caribbean Black British diaspora music, in the form of Nubia Garcia and Moses Boyd and Shabaka Hutchings. These are all young Black British artists who, in many cases, have familial ties, to the Caribbean, and they're speaking from this kind of cosmopolitan London experience. It's similar to what Steve McQueen chronicles in his series Small Axe. There's just all this vitality on that scene. And it's really exciting because it's not just the ancestral, the sort of motherland expression that we're seeing there, but it's also the kind of specific character of the London, the heterogeneous London thing, which is its own thing, and so it's exciting to see that expressed in the music.
Do you worry about the scenes in places that don't have that kind of connection to the African diaspora? I mean, you write about the scene in China. There are obviously, some African people and African descended people in China, but not nearly as many as there are in London. Do you think that a scene in a place that doesn't have that kind of direct connection to Black culture can be as vibrant as a London or a New York?
I think it can definitely be vibrant. I don't know if I'd want to get into a sort of this or that comparison, but I will tell you that I was quite honestly surprised by the level of acuity and really kind of fluency in the modern jazz language that I encountered in Beijing. And this is fascinating because a big part of that was due to technology. It was due to the fact that musicians, with their time difference, musicians were able to wake up in the morning and over their breakfast table tune into the live stream from Smalls. And this is years ago before live streams were the norm. But just having that access, to just be a fly on the wall in just whatever's happening, whatever is happening at ground level in New York City was being, digested through a feed across the world. And simply because of that, I mean, you really cannot overstate what a transformative thing that is for someone who is otherwise so disconnected from our scene, and it's not easy to get materials, but the internet really has changed that whole proposition. And so the jazz scene in China, which this was really fascinating to me. And this is why I spend as much time on this scene in the book as I do, because I felt like the story of jazz in Europe it's a really long one, and it really deserves its own sustained narrative. But the story of jazz in China is young and recent enough, and still enough of an unfolding story, that I felt like I had the rare opportunity to check something out that is still very much on the upswing and kind of chronicle the beginnings of a thing. It was really exciting. And I do hope that someday I have the opportunity to go back and just kind of see what has happened since.
China obviously has its own, very long and beautiful musical tradition, also often involving improvisation. Has that influence started to influence the type of jazz that's made there? Is that the development that's happened yet?
Among some people, I would say yes, but most of what I encountered, certainly in Beijing, was very much you could have felt, if you went to the East Shore Cafe, you would feel like you had just tripped down the stairs into Smalls. It was like a very close approximation of what is happening right now in the New York scene. And so there is, often we see a multi-phase process where, step one is like really persuasive assimilation of a language. And I think that's where they're at right now. I'm speaking in generalities, but
sure.
But this is what I encountered. It was just like, it was still just within the last, easily within the last decade that we see a widespread, level of facility among younger players in China, where they you could sort of parachute them into the scene in New York, and they would be fine. They could just drop right in. That's so new. And so I do think, and I expect, that we are going to begin to see more expressions of traditional Chinese instruments, traditional Chinese song forms in the the mainstream jazz expression. But as far as what I witnessed, it hasn't quite happened yet.
Mm-hmm. Finally, at the end of your book, you have a list of the most important, or your favorite, maybe, or your, in your opinion, what are the most important jazz albums of the century. But since the book was published a couple of years ago, it only goes up to 2018, at least in my edition. If you were to release a new edition, what are some albums you would include for 2019, 2020, and maybe even 2021?
Great question. I will refer you to a handful of albums that really topped my my year-end best lists in the last several years. In 2020, two that I will very quickly steer you toward are Ambrose Akinmusiri's album, which is called "The Tender Spot on Every Calloused Moment." Just a really beautiful and remarkable document of his quartet. I also love an album he released a couple years ago called Origami Harvest, which is very different. This one incorporates a string quartet and electronics and spoken word by Kool A.D., who some people know as a former member of the hip-hop duo Das Racist. So Ambrose, those two albums. In 2020, the Maria Schneider Orchestra released an album called Data Lords, a double album that really, I think, stands as one of the most impressive large ensemble statements in a very long time. I mean, there is no band executing at the level that the Maria Schneider Orchestra does. They're unbelievable, and the attunement that she has with that band as a composer and orchestrator is just it's astonishing. And so that's one I would definitely steer you toward. And let's see, it's funny, when you're just constantly writing about this music, you sort of lose your grip on time, and you forget, like, well, when did that come out? I will say that in 2019, let's see, thinking now, one of the albums that really kind of came out of left field a bit and garnered a lot of justified critical acclaim is by a pianist named Chris Davis. And she appears just kind of briefly toward the end of my book. But she's another artist like Tyshawn, who I think, if I were starting this now, I would be definitely thinking about Chris Davis as a focal point. And this album she made is called Diatom Ribbons. It's very much it's not the feel of a band playing in a room. It's very much a kind of carefully constructed studio product. But it features Terry Lynn Carrington on drums and Esperanza Spalding on spoken word, and other musicians like guitarists Nels Klein and Mark Rebo. And it's just, and I should say too, that there's a turntablist, Val Ginty, who is really integral to the sound of this album. It's just fascinating. It's another example of the kinds of, creative devices that musicians are bringing to the table. So those are three, right? Those are three good ones. There's
certainly a good place to start.
yeah. And also I would say, Cecile has just continued to do great work. And so, she has every album that she's put out has been essential.
Well, Nate Chinen, thanks so much for being on New Books in Performing Arts. I really loved the book Playing Changes so much. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about it.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.